Hey there, Chloe here, your podcast co-host. We get asked all the time what we do to take care of ourselves. So we decided to gather the top 5 self-care tips and techniques we use on the daily and gift them to you for free. We're calling it the ultimate self-care bundle to clear your energy, boost your vitality, and feed your soul. We'll share the golden rule to health, well-being, and happiness no one should live without. A delicious energetic detox bath recipe that both relaxes and clears energetic invasions at the same time. A quick immune boost we swear by, and 2 other goodies that will support you when you need it the most. So if you're feeling drained, out of sync, or just need a little or big reset, go to lachiaramethod.com/podcast-bundle to claim your free gift. That link will also be in the show notes. We hope these tools bring you as much support as they brought to our lives. Now let's get on with the show. Welcome to the Activate Change podcast, where transformation is just a conversation away. Some episodes of this podcast offer an intimate front row seat to an authentic and unscripted personal healing session with renowned healer and creator of the La Chiara method, Gabriele La Chiara. Our incredibly generous and courageous guests explore their genuine struggles, longings, and deepest desires in these sessions. And we, as listeners, have the honor and privilege to witness their sacred and profound healing journeys. As you listen, we invite you to receive as well, feeling into where the healing and insights that transpire might spark transformation in your own life. And stay tuned until the end because I, Chloe Faith Urban, will discuss the session and share a skill or framework that Gabriele used, which you can apply to your own personal healing. And because of the La Chiara method's deep commitment to collaboration and perpetual learning, some episodes will highlight conversations with other thought leaders, healers, and activists on the path to bring healing, liberation, and true equality to the world. This podcast does contain adult language and content, so if you have little ones around you, you may want to use headphones. Welcome to this week's episode of the Activate Change podcast. Today, we're diving deep into a topic that is both challenging and profoundly transformative. What does it take to truly thrive after experiencing trauma? And how does trauma shape us in ways we might not even realize? These are questions that hit close to home for me, especially as someone who has walked the incredibly challenging healing road after sexual trauma. That's why I'm especially excited to share this conversation with you. In this episode, I, Chloe, am so honored to share with you an interview I did in 2019 with Dr. Thema Bryant, who's such an inspiring and powerful voice in the field of trauma recovery. Her approach is a unique blend of psychology, spirituality, and embodied healing practices. In the conversation, we explore the nuances of interpersonal trauma and why it often impacts survivors differently than other types of trauma. Dr. Thema also emphasizes the importance of understanding cultural context and how oppression plays a significant role in trauma and the healing process. Her insights on reclaiming sexuality and reconnecting with the body after trauma were especially meaningful to me, and I believe they'll resonate with many of you who are survivors of sexual trauma. And if you're not a survivor, but are close to someone that is, especially if you're in a romantic partnership with them, my hope is that this will help bring more awareness as to how to support your partner and navigate your shared intimacy with greater understanding. Before we dive into the conversation, here's just a little bit more about Dr. Thema Bryant. Dr. Thema Bryant completed her doctorate in clinical psychology at Duke University and her postdoctoral training at Harvard Medical Center's Victims of Violence program. Upon graduating, she became the coordinator of the Princeton University SHARE program, which provides intervention and prevention programming to combat sexual assault, sexual harassment, and harassment based on sexual orientation. She is currently a tenured professor of psychology in the Graduate School of Education and Psychology at Pepperdine University, where she directs the Culture and Trauma Research Laboratory. Her clinical and research interests center on interpersonal trauma and the societal trauma of oppression. She is a past president of the Society for the Psychology of Women and a past APA representative to the United Nations. Dr. Thema also served on the APA Committee on International Relations in Psychology and the Committee on Women in Psychology. Having earned a Master's of Divinity, Dr. Thema is an ordained elder in the African Methodist Episcopal Church. She directs the mental health ministry at First Aim Church in South Los Angeles. Dr. Thema also utilizes sacred dance and spoken word in therapy, community forums, and faith communities. A member of the Association of Black Psychologists, she incorporates culturally based interventions in her teaching, research, and practice. Dr. Thema is the host of the Homecoming podcast, a mental health podcast to facilitate your journey home to your authentic self. To find out more about Dr. Thema, go to drthema.com. That's THEMA. And that link will also be in the show notes. Without further ado, let's dive in. I am so thrilled today to welcome Dr. Thema Bryant Davis. Thank you so much for being here.
Oh, thank you for having me. I'm excited about it.
As I was sort of looking over your book, you talk about really interpersonal trauma in the book. And can you explain to me the difference between interpersonal trauma and other sorts of trauma and how that kind of trauma might have a different impact on people?
Oh, absolutely. So interpersonal trauma is trauma that is enacted upon you by another person. Other forms of trauma are like natural disaster or a medical trauma if it wasn't about someone infecting you, but just kind of a naturally occurring, or you may have had an accident at work. And so when you have the additional component of a person intentionally bringing harm to you, then that adds the layer of distrust. It adds the layer of the shame and self-blame of trying to figure out, why was I targeted? What is it that they saw in me that made them think that was okay to do? What does that mean about me? How do I make meaning about future relationships? One of the challenges, whether the perpetrator, and in most cases it's someone known to you, whether we're talking about physical violence or sexual violence, those are done by strangers, but usually it's a person that is known to you. And so it can really cause your sense of your own judgment to be shaken up, because how did I not see it coming, right? As I thought this person was safe, or I thought I was okay. Or some people, their trust in humanity is disrupted because some survivors, especially if they didn't grow up with childhood trauma, will say things like, I didn't know people were capable of doing such harm to another person. There are those who are survivors of complex trauma where there have been multiple violations. And one of the challenges is, if you have been abused or violated once, your risk is increased for re-victimization. So it can really shake up not only your view of yourself, of other people, but about what are relationships at their core, which is why some people get the idea that you can't trust anyone and that it's all about power and control. So either I will come to expect that others are going to try to take advantage of me, or I want to make sure that never happens to me. So I may become very controlling myself. As opposed to, with natural disasters, people may have like distrust or confusion related to their faith, right? Because people say God sent this storm, and they have to try to grapple with, how do I make sense of my faith given that these events are happening, but it doesn't feel so much personal. I will say sometimes these things can co-occur, where like with Hurricane Katrina, the hurricane was a trauma, but then people were neglected and not serviced. So then that becomes another issue of some trauma survivors get more compassion, resources, sympathy than others. Often those are related to our various identities. And so It can be both things, a non-personal that then becomes personal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me. And I want to move into the cultural piece here soon, but I heard something you said about how if you've been traumatized once, you're more apt to have it happen again. Why is that?
So there are multiple factors. One that is easy to see is when we think about children, is usually what sets children up is access, right? Who has access to them? So, for example, if you have children with unmonitored time, or the person who is supposed to be taking care of them is not really on it, or is the perpetrator themselves, then it leaves them open to multiple people, right? So let's say, for example, you have either parents, who just are working hard and may have like a couple of jobs. So you come home by yourself, and depending on where you're living, neighbors may start to notice that you're by yourself a lot. So then multiple ones prey on you, right? Or let's say you have a parent who has a substance abuse problem. So they're kind of checked out, or they may invite company over who is very compromised and under the influence. And so it puts you in an environment where you're more prone for things happening. The other piece is, and this is around the sexual trauma, is people usually hear the response is fight or flight. So those are the more common ones you hear. So there's a third one, which is freeze. And some of us, when you were not able to physically get away, you escape in your mind and you just wait for it to be over. So if that becomes kind of your go-to when future predators come up and they start making advances, your body may actually tell you, just kind of escape. So you're frozen and waiting for it to be over. As you may also have the experience from early on that when I say no, people don't care, that my voice doesn't matter. So why bother to say anything? Just wait and it won't be that bad, which is unfortunate. But all of those things can set us up.
Yeah.
For abuse.
That makes total sense. That was definitely my experience. I had sexual trauma when I was really young. And then, 1920, I kept having incidences where I was like, I didn't even know how to say no, or I did say no, but they didn't listen and I didn't fight it back. And it just was so interesting to see. And then the shame that comes in of like, oh, now I'm an adult and I can't protect myself.
And I'm glad you raised that, because it's so terrible that then we develop this self-blame. Right. And, it's kind of a natural thing that a survivor will replay in their minds, like, what could I have done differently? And that's what we all do, because going forward, you don't want it to happen again, but also it can leave you in a place of carrying a responsibility that's not yours, right? Even if there's something I wish I hadn't done, I'll give the example of people who meet dates online, online dating, and then they go out with the person, they go back to that person's place, and then they're violated. So they may say to themselves, like, I shouldn't have gone there. Well, sure, you may say that to yourself, and the person should not have done with it.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, that makes so much sense. And, in your book, you really talk about the cultural context of trauma and how important it is to look at that, and how that's such a missing link in a lot of people's healing is actually looking at that. Can you speak to how culture has an impact on our healing as survivors? And
yeah, absolutely. So there are both cultural barriers and cultural resources. A cultural barrier may be like distrust of authority figures or helping professionals, where, in some communities, I'd say particularly ethnic minority communities, low income communities, people don't traditionally view police officers as there to help them. So whereas another child may grow up with this notion of like officer friendly, and like, if I'm ever in trouble, run and tell the police. Other people are growing up with the message of when you see them, run the other way, or else they will hurt you, right? Or our experiences with doctors or even mental health professionals. I've had so many African-American children where their association with a therapist or a social worker is that those are the people who take you out of your house, who remove you from your parents. That does happen, but it's not, all that people do, but that reality then affects people's help seeking. So, when there's a stigma about asking for help, it's not just like cultural blinders. There's usually a reason for it of what created that distrust, something to earn it. And then another piece is, let's say, for LGBT community and for ethnic minorities, is this idea that people already think all of these bad things about us. So you don't want to give them any more information. Like if people already think it's terrible to be a gay man and now you're being abused by your partner, not feeling really safe or comfortable calling the police because they may laugh at you. And that may not just be in your head, but people have had that experience. Or they may kind of blame you of like, well, that's what you get for having been at this gay club, and that's why you were violated. Or, for ethnic minorities, this idea that there are already so many of us that are locked up. So people have this thing of like, I don't want to put another person from our community in jail, so then I won't say anything. And at the same time, no one's doing anything to protect you. So at last barrier I'll mention is for people who are religious, is oftentimes there is a message that you're just supposed to forgive. If you're spiritual or if you're a good Christian person, you don't hold grudges. At least you never get angry, right? Because if there's no room for anger. Anger is bad. Depression is bad. You're supposed to be grateful and peaceful and, all these things. There is no space for people's pain or wounds or the reality of suffering, which makes people stuff it. And then it shows up in other ways. They can't speak about it, but it's showing up in their eating or not eating, and the loss of sleep, and hair falling out, and backache, right? It's showing up, but without words. But the good part is there are also cultural resources. So like psychotherapy is, relatively new, but looking at what did people who came before you do to heal, and like learning how to incorporate some of those things, like the arts, like our spirituality, like real community. So, authentic community is where I can actually tell the truth and be myself, and that be celebrated and embraced. So, some of those cultural traditions are also activism. Like, what can we do to have like a neighborhood watch or to try to organize for these things not to keep happening?
You're right. Yeah. Makes so much sense to me. And yeah, it just feels so complex. It's almost like you can't even look at any issue without looking at culture.
Right. It's so true. And at Pepperdine, when we're training our students, it's like you can't ignore who's sitting in front of you. Like it's easier if people say, well, depression is depression, anxiety is anxiety, but it's all happening within a context, within a person, and how they experience it and make meaning of it, and how other people respond to them and see them. Do other people see them as innocent or worthy of protection? Or in general, has the media and society already depicted them as unworthy?
I had heard you talk about sort of exposure therapy, or the importance of really, as survivors, instead of just stuffing it and holding it and keeping it a secret for years and years, the importance of actually speaking about what happened. Can you speak to why that's important?
Yes. So a couple of things. One is speaking about it shatters the shame, can begin the process of shattering the shame. That when I can't name it, there's a part of me that can't name it because of embarrassment and the fear of what you'll think about me if you know that part of me. And that's based both in messages from society, but also the message I'm telling myself. And because I'm carrying shame about it as well, then it makes it difficult for me to speak about it. The other part is when some people feel like they can't. So I want to name that there is a physiological piece that with trauma, it is actually neurologically, physiologically difficult to retrieve traumatic memories and to speak about them, right? So it's like, but in addition to that when I feel the story is bigger than me, or what happened is bigger than me, then I am lost in it. Then it continues to have power over me. It's like to even think about it, I will become unraveled. When I'm in that place, I'm not, quote unquote, over it, or I haven't worked through it. I'm running from it. And so when I can get to a place of peace within myself where what I say to clients is, your trauma affects you, but it doesn't define you. So it definitely had an impact. There's no question. right? It affects us emotionally, our ability to concentrate and focus, our relationship with our bodies, intimacy, all of these things. And yet, there are parts of me that are not limited to what was done to me, right? And when I am so busy running from that part of my truth, then it covers up everything else. And that becomes like the center of my being, even though I'm not speaking it. So it can be very liberating, not only to speak it, but to speak it to someone who still validates me. Because that's the fear, is like, all these people like me, but it's because they don't know, right? If they knew my truth, they wouldn't, really still choose me or appreciate me. And so to have that experience of, like, 'cause what is love if it's not based on being known and being seen, right? Then you don't really love me. You love the picture I have presented of who I am. But when I can say, like, this is it. This is my whole story. And a person to see that and still say, yes, and you're wonderful, and for me to see that, right? Even before anybody else, for me to recognize the fullness of my story, the complexity of my story, and still celebrate myself.
I love that.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It just feels so powerful. I mean, I really loved what you were talking about, just about like the love, like love becomes, it's almost like when we share and we're accepted and we're loved in the face of it, then you actually trust that people can love you. There's like different layer or level of intimacy.
Yes.
But when you're keeping it secret, you can't even really get to that kind of
intimacy. Right.
Like, well, if they knew, then
if they knew. Right. The person they love is my representative. It's not really me. I do want to mention, though, for those maybe who haven't gone to therapy, if they're in a place where they're not wanting to or not ready to tell their story, there are other forms of trauma-informed therapy that don't focus on the narrative. So like stress inoculation therapy is a way of addressing like the stress that rises up in the present and preparing for it to help you to navigate and to cope and to negotiate so that you're not constantly feeling overwhelmed or distressed. And then also like mindfulness does not require like going through the narrative. So there are things to be gained, even if in your mind you're like, I'm not trying to tell it.
I'm not going there yet or ever. Thank you very much.
And some people will say never.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. And I'm curious why embodied healing is important for trauma survivors.
Yes. So many types of trauma happen to the body, right? So the body is actually a part of the traumatic experience, whether we're talking about physical violence, sexual violence, medical trauma. Even in a natural disaster, there is a physiological impact of that panic. A community violence, gang violence, it is done to the body. So then to leave the body out of the healing process, it doesn't make sense. What happens is a lot of therapy gives people an escape by allowing them to just intellectualize.
Yeah.
And we can all get caught up in our thoughts, which feeds anxiety, right? Because you can think and overthink and create new things to worry about. And, and people can do that for years. They're doing talk. But, what I say to clients and to myself is that you can know something here, but how do you get it here? Because a person they can know from the day it happened that it wasn't their fault. And it doesn't change the fact that it feels like it was their fault or they still feel the shame. And so to get at that core piece often involves doing more than talking. And so engaging in activating the body. And it's also a way of reclaiming the body, that some people after trauma develop a hatred of their bodies or a disconnection because they either blame their bodies and say, it's because of how I look that this happened to me, or my body has brought me nothing but trouble. And so when they can claim, in yoga, the warrior pose, or in dance to be able to that you get to choose. You have control over where your body goes. Then you have a different experience of liberation in your body, freedom in your body, reclaiming your sexuality in your body, being at home within yourself, so that you're not walking around with this thing that you despise, but instead, owning it, enjoying it, appreciating it, nurturing it.
I love that. And it feels so important too to just speak quickly, because it's come up a few times of just like sexual abuse survivors. It's a different experience, and sexuality then becomes a very complex experience as a survivor, at least it has for me. And I'm curious, like, what are the pieces of really coming into the body and helping to ease into those experiences in a different way and like reclaim it without just shutting down?
Yes, absolutely. That's great. So with it's particularly challenging if people's first sexual experience was one of violation, right? Because then that like created the roadmap and like the script about what this is all about. And so, we talk about in psychology cognitive distortions, which are just thoughts that I have that aren't accurate, but I believe them intensely because of my experience. It really, for a number of people, is a faith walk, meaning, can I believe that there could be anything good about this when I have not experienced it, right? You may say, like, either everyone's lying or it's good for them, but me. And so, and that's really what healing or transformation is about. Can I believe something I haven't yet experienced? And so a challenge becomes not only the belief that it's just something bad that people do to you or take from you, or they owe you something. I was talking to a survivor of sex trafficking who was describing after she got out of that once she was dating, intimacy was hard because after she would be intimate with her partner, she felt robbed because he wasn't giving her anything materially. That whole experience, because she was trafficked as a young person, that it was an exchange. It's not something for women.
Wow, right.
For you, and then they're supposed to either give you some shoes or money or drugs or a place to stay. So then it was like, well, what did I get? Right? Wow. So this notion of that your experience of sex as transaction or as violation or objectification was a misuse of what it actually is. It really is about you receiving as much as you're giving. It's about, being seen and seeing and trusting. And so sometimes it's very concrete things to help people, like telling survivors to open your eyes. You're likely to have a flashback with your eyes closed in the dark. And especially like when a hand goes a certain place or particular position, it's going to all go back there. And so, talking with your partner and having your partner keep talking to you, so it keeps you in the present, so that you're not like having to go in combat mode or shutdown mode, and owning that some people have the opposite. As opposed to feeling disconnected from their bodies, some people have adopted the perspective that my body is all I have to offer. So that's the thing that's going to make people choose me. And this idea of like, I got to really put it on them, right? I'm going to do all my tricks because it's my one special thing. So expanding people's ideas, so it's not something I have to give to be chosen or to be valuable or to be enough, that it is a part of me, right? But it's one dimension in many dimensions and many things, that many aspects of who I am.
Thank you for speaking to that. It just feels like such an important piece for trauma survivors, because it's something that's a part of all of our lives. Yeah. I'm curious for you to just talk about what liturgical dance is and how that can also help with trauma survivors, and what that journey's been like for you.
Sure, absolutely. So liturgical comes from the word liturgy, which is like public worship. So this idea of sacred dance and sacred movement is just like we say, we shouldn't leave the body out, is also not leaving out our spirituality. One of the components when we talk about the effects of trauma is usually people think emotional and physical, but it can also affect people's spirituality. So either their spiritual sense of themselves, of humanity, of who God is, or where was God in all of this. And so reclaiming all of that to say, I want my body back. I want my spirituality back. However that looks for me, that's a part of myself. And the public part of it is that really breaks down the shame, is that, it's wonderful to like dance by yourself, but there is another liberating piece that happens about dancing in community. And so it is that sharing of our spirits in that way. And there are different forms of liturgical dance, so it doesn't have to all be happy, happy, joy, joy. So there's like the praise part, which is like, more from that joyful place. There is liturgical dance that is more like a prayer. And so really giving voice to, without words, with movement, giving voice to where I am and what I need, even for survivors who haven't told their story. One of the things I love about the arts is you can tell your story in poetry or dance or music, and you control the metaphor. So people will know as much or as little as you choose. Like I could do a dance that is very descriptive, and you'll know like, oh, that looks like violation. Or it could be very subtle, but because I know it's healing for me. And so in that way, it being a prayer, because the prayer is like that honest, unfiltered conversation, right? That honest, unfiltered, it can be both a plea and a recognition of like, this is where I am and I need things to shift. I desperately need something to change. So another form of liturgical dance is like testimony. So that's part of like dancing out your story. And then there is also another form called warfare. That's so important because many trauma survivors feel powerless, right? Feel just vulnerable and empty and uncovered, unprotected, that no one advocated for me or came for me or understood me or fought for me or was outraged for me, right? It's liberating you don't want them to like take over your story, but when you share your story and someone is bothered that happened to you, there is a healing in that. And so it's an empowerment to be honest. Our healing and recovery is a fight because, going to sessions when you don't feel like going, getting out your yoga mat when you'd rather like lay under 5 million covers, all day, Netflix or eating, you have no business eating, but that comfort food, so it's like to fight myself and say, I want to be well, I want to be whole, I want to be better. I do not, the offender attempts to erase us, it's like that you don't matter, just their needs matter, you don't matter. And so for me to resist that and say like, I matter, my needs matter, my hunger matters, my dreams matter, I matter. So I'm going to have to fight for me because I matter. And I can't wait for somebody else to do it. Like I'm going to have to fight for myself so that I'm not consumed by all of this. So that is the liturgical dance. That is combining your mind, body, and your spirit. You can do it by yourself, but it also is beautiful to do in community with other people and moving in your truth. Yeah.
And is it, are there sort of steps that you draw from, or is it completely improvisational or?
Right. So there's both. There is improvisational and there's choreography. And the choreography can come from all different forms of dance. So there can be liturgical contemporary, which is more like modern liturgical ballet. There's even liturgical tap dance, liturgical hip hop. So you can use any dance form. Liturgical African, but it's that sacred, the spirit that is infused in it, so that it's not just about like entertainment, but it is like that notion of connecting with the spirit.
I do ecstatic dance, so I am dancing in community weekly, but it's different. It's like, in a way it is like, it's a completely spiritual experience, and that's crazy amazing for my healing. And I just love the actually like truly owning and saying, this is me, owning my story, being in my story, owning and asking for the spiritual tradition and faith. And and all of it. I love how it's all woven together. And
oh, that's beautiful.
beautiful. Yeah.
And to get both of those together, the movement and community together,
Yeah.
great. It's great.
So healing.
Yeah. So putting those pieces together where there's not a focus on performance or, proving our flexibility or what have you, but really connecting from that spiritual sense to your ancestors, to the people who came before you, and that, we come from each of us a legacy of survivors, like people and stories known and unknown, like people who lived through some tragic things and yet had genius and brilliance and gifts to hold the complexity of it all, and to also not feel so disconnected, because trauma makes you feel isolated. And so what does it mean from a spiritual sense to believe, that I have ancestors, right? That I have a line of people, not only before me, but like the unborn, whether from my womb or from someone else, but that are connected to me, those who are coming up, and that I'm trying to create a space that will make what they inhabit better, right? So we are connected to this line, this historical line, versus I'm just out here flailing by myself, right? Which doesn't feel good.
No, it's a little isolating, a little lonely.
Yeah.
I love that idea of really like breaking the cycle. Like if there is the trauma through the ancestors, like we have to claim and do something different for the
right. Right. It's so true. And we were mentioning the different types of trauma. Another one is called either historical trauma, or some people call it intergenerational trauma. And so even if your foreparents didn't tell you the details of it, you carry it. It affects like the way they parented you, right?
Yeah.
And just genetically, we carry that. And so, that sometimes we're not just healing our stuff, but we may be healing the stuff that has been passed down to us.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely. It feels so important to honor that.
Right.
Right. Because I mean, I definitely have clients that come in and they're like, well, I haven't been, like, as far as I know, traumatized or violated in this lifetime, but like there's trauma in here. Like I can feel it, to be like, oh, we can actually dive in and see like where that's coming from the ancestors and how far back and what, how it's really impacted them. And I just love that
right. And it's true because, oftentimes, I would say generationally and culturally that people didn't tell those stories. I can remember before my grandmother passed, I wanted to ask her about I interviewed her, asked her about her experience, growing up in the South at that time. And her response was, oh, I'm blessed. And her response literally was, I don't want to meet my maker with a bitter heart. It's okay. Right? Now, she didn't want to speak it, but did it affect the way she raised her 10 children? Definitely. And then how those children raised us? Yes, even without the details that it shows up. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I just know from my grandmother, like I know she's been through stuff, and yet she's so in that just like Zen mode of like, oh, it's all good. We're not going to have any big, deep conversations. And then you're like, but I know there's a lot going on in there. And then for me or my mother to then learn like, oh, you don't speak about that sort of thing, and then how that impacts us as well. And
I just take time and recognize that there's wisdom I have that predates me, right? And just sitting in that wisdom. So, because one of the things we do as survivors, because of the self-doubt, is we say things all the time like, I don't know, I'm not sure. And so I say, it's even progress where if instead of saying I'm confused, I say I know, but I'm afraid. That's often the truth. Because I know what's happening, or I know what I need to do, but I feel anxious about doing it, which is different from like, I don't know.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I just love that. And also just, I mean, it almost speaks right to the piece of like being in your yes and being in your no, and even knowing what that is, or the lines of it, or how to even be in your no or be in your yes and be okay about it, or have a desire and speak to that desire instead of afraid to speak to it, or vice versa. And I love just sitting with those different pieces and actually even like bringing up an issue and just being like, okay, I'm going to sit.
Yes.
Pose for a bit and feel it. And
that's good.
Love it.
Right? Oh, thank you.
You're amazing. This has been such a pleasure to be with you.
I so enjoyed it. This is wonderful.
Thank you so much. And thank you all for listening as well. Wasn't that the most amazing conversation? I'm so honored to have been able to have that conversation with Dr. Thema. And Dr. Thema, thank you so much for agreeing to have this on our podcast. I hope that there were some nuggets and insights here for you to take into your own life. And we will see you next time. Saying a huge thank you to Ali Halpert, the incredible musician and songwriter behind the songs featured in this podcast. To hear more of Ali's music and learn more, visit Ali's website at alihalpert.com. You can find the link in our show notes.